Good morning, everyone. This is James Gom at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development here in Geneva. Thank you all for taking the time to join us today for this session, during which we'll be taking a deep dive into the critical and challenging issue of embedding human rights into corporate governance. We've got a packed agenda today with some exciting speakers, so without further ado, let's get going. So, if you indulge me for a little bit before we get started, just a bit of housekeeping, laying the agenda for today. So I'll get things going with a quick introduction and a couple of updates on the human rights work that we're doing here at WBCSD, a bit of scene setting. And then I'm pleased to be handing over to our first guest speaker, Richard Bull, of the Global Head of Business and Human Rights at KPMG, who will be sharing his insights into what makes for effective human rights governance. And after that, we're also very pleased to be joined by Andre Veneman, the Corporate Director of Sustainability at AkzoNobel, who will give us the benefit of his experience in integrating human rights into Akzo's business systems. And then we should have around 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of the session, which will bring us to a close at around 11 a.m. European time. In terms of questions, I think it's probably easiest if you feel free at any stage during the presentations to jot down any questions you may have. You'll see to the right-hand side of your screen there's a little orange button in the top right-hand corner. If you click that to open the toolbar, you'll see a tab called Questions, and feel free to type your questions in there, and then I'll collect them all at the end of the session and put them all to Andre and Richard. So that's probably the best way to do it. If you would feel a burning desire to speak as well, you can click the raise your hand button, and we can try and do it the old-fashioned way, have you speak as well. So very quickly, from my side, in terms of introduction, I'd just like to take the opportunity to remind you of some of the key human rights work that we're engaging in here at WBCSD this year, under the overarching objective of supporting you all as you work to embed human rights due diligence into your operations, and encouraging this culture of collaboration between members, helping us to leverage the collective experience and expertise of our network. We've identified a number of priority engagement areas for 2017. I won't go into all of them in detail here, but you can see from the ones we've listed that we intend to carry on our regular human rights briefing notes, as well as this webinar program. And then we'll be supplementing this as well with an online members-only human rights portal, online portal, which will act as a kind of repository for a wide range of useful human rights resources, including our briefing notes, the webinars, and other proprietary material, and we'll be looking to launch that ahead of our council meeting in Mexico later this year. In addition to this, the other thing I'd like to touch on in a little bit more detail is the workshops that we're holding throughout the course of this year. Some of you were kind enough to join us in London back in January, where we had our first workshop for the year, around 20 companies coming together for what proved to be very fruitful discussions in identifying common challenges and solutions around human rights due diligence and reporting. And as some of you may have seen from the email I sent yesterday, we've now locked in some dates for some subsequent workshops taking place in Johannesburg, New York, and Delhi over the course of the next few months. And these sessions, like the one in London, are being organized in collaboration with SHIFT and the UN Global Compact. And again, we'll look to provide a comprehensive introduction to the concept of respect for human rights in the corporate sphere, as well as exploring best practice in terms of human rights due diligence, integration, and reporting. So I encourage you very much to share details of these events with your colleagues in the regions. And also, please feel free to send to subsidiaries, partners, or suppliers as well that you feel would be interested and benefit from these sessions. Turning now to today's agenda of governance, and a little bit of background from our side in terms of why we chose to focus on this topic today. Many of you may have seen this chart. I try and trot it out at every available opportunity, but we put this together in November last year for an issue brief that we published, depicting the evolving business and human rights landscape since the launch of the UN Guiding Principles back in 2011. And I won't go into too much detail, but basically, I think this graphic shows quite well the fact that the landscape is maturing very quickly, and we're seeing fast evolving regulatory environment with all the regulations emerging on the left-hand side of the circle, and then all of the other initiatives evolving, showing on the right-hand side sort of enhanced scrutiny on the business world in terms of how it addresses the issue of human rights as well. So against that backdrop, a little bit more on the regulation side, we're certainly seeing a shift now, I think, along a continuum from soft to hard law, with non-binding instruments like the UN Guiding Principles giving way to emerging legislation, not only for human rights reporting, but also for due diligence, with new regulations like those in France, Holland, and Switzerland, confirming new requirements for companies to conduct human rights due diligence. So, mounting legal obligations and more reason to ensure that human rights risks are integrated into core business operations through strong governance. And the degree to which companies have this strong governance is now also increasingly under scrutiny. As many of you are aware, in March this year we saw the launch of the Corporate Human Rights Benchmark by a number of investors and civil society organizations, which ranked 98 companies in terms of their human rights performance. And looking at the methodology, how that score comes about, 10% of that assessment is based around governance and policies that companies have in place. So, and you can see there from the figure in the bottom right-hand corner of the slide there that the governance and policy commitment scoring was actually, on average, quite low. One of the lowest scoring areas that the companies ranked in. So, an area for improvement for many companies still. So, when it comes to governance around human rights, I think there's definitely space for us to explore more around what we can do to ensure that this is an element that's successfully embedded within our organizations to prepare for emerging risks, and how we can set up systems that will stand up to enhanced external scrutiny of our operations. So with all of that in mind, this is a topic that we'd like to take a deep dive into today, and very pleased to have our first speaker, Richard from KPMG. As I said, Richard has a wealth of experience in this field, having had his own consultancy before joining KPMG, and we'd like to hear his reflections on effective human rights governance. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Richard.
Thank you, James, and good morning or other time zones. Greetings to the other participants. James, I was just reflecting on your circles with the UN Guiding Principles in the middle, and I was just reflecting on my first experience of seeing human rights integrated directly into the business principles at a global level within a global corporate, and that was Shell back in 1997. So I guess just a point of reflection when we talk about business and human rights and the corporate responsibility to respect human rights, there's actually practice that's now going back some 20 more and more years that we can also still learn from, and I think we should still draw on for, and certainly in terms of what I'm hoping to do this morning, is just offer some insights, perhaps going to the next slide, James, and just a quick picture of myself, not because I'm vain, but hopefully just give you an image there in terms of a picture to put to the voice. And then the third slide, James, because primarily what I wanted to do was talk to some of the key insights that we gained from a piece of work that we did towards the end of last year, where we engaged with 11 global corporations, and the key people who were driving the business human rights agenda, as well as senior executives and certainly some CEOs as well. And that's the Addressing Human Rights in Business Executive Perspectives paper. I'll give the link to it at the very end, but I just wanted to move on now and offer some of the insights that came from that, and I guess my own experiences as well in terms of 20 years of working in this area of embedding and certainly looking to raise the issue of the corporate responsibility to respect human rights into the governance mechanisms and certainly the governance levels of corporations. Next slide, James, in terms of, we looked when we did the interviews with some, I think it was 15 representatives of those 11 corporations. And if I could just move you on, James, to the next slide, thank you. And there were 4 key drivers. James has already touched on one of those in terms of what we're seeing at the moment around regulatory pressure, and that's certainly been our direct experience and my direct experience in the recent sort of year and a half, and particularly with the Modern Slavery Act. And if I can just take an Australian perspective and offer that, if there's one thing that has certainly raised the profile of the corporate responsibility to respect human rights at the board level, it is compliance requirements where a sign-off is required from the highest officer within the organisation or within the corporation. So within the Australian context, we've seen major corporates who are headquartered in Australia put the Modern Slavery Act, UK Modern Slavery Act, because of their activities in the UK, onto the agenda. And I think from a responsibility perspective, certainly what I've seen as that's gained more traction and visibility, and we now have our own inquiry in Australia into a Modern Slavery Act for the Australian context, is the legal counsel and the company secretary taking on more responsibility for the human rights responsibilities of the company. So I was just going to go around and reflect on these drivers and what that means for where responsibility is being taken. Because if I think back, 15 years, I would say that it was largely the sustainability person, the most senior sustainability person that was leading the charge in terms of raising awareness around the company's human rights responsibilities. Certainly with the guiding principles, I've seen that dramatically change where that responsibility now is much more broadly taken on. From a reputation and relationship point of view in terms of those key drivers, and starting to see much more involvement from corporate affairs in terms of asking questions, and around that the relationship with employees being a key dynamic there, as well as head of HR, head of human resources, taking the lead on the agenda. And sort of finally around company purpose, one thing that has surprised me at times is hearing, and I heard this from a major retailer, it was the chair of the audit committee at the end of last year, when I asked him, look, why had that particular audit committee, what was its key focus for the last 18 months? His answer was it was procurement. And yes, it's a major retailer, so perhaps you think there's a logic in that. And when I asked why had the audit committee taken that focus on procurement, the answer was that the key risk management control that very large retailer had with over 200,000 employees in many jurisdictions was the culture and the values of the company. And when they reflected on where 18 months before my questioning of him, when they reflected on where the biggest risk was in terms of alignment with the values of the business, they felt that that was in the procurement area. Hence, they brought a focus to respect for human rights around procurement decision making into that audit committee from a governance perspective. So I thought that again was a very interesting driver, and I guess that's that company purpose, company value driver that then has led in that particular scenario to a governance, truly that highest governance level, formally taking on a level of responsibility for putting human rights into practice, in this case through the procurement function. So a number of drivers there that in my experience have then resulted in different areas taking primary responsibility for driving respect for human rights. If I could just get you to move to the next slide, James. I won't spend too much time on this slide, essentially remembering that the governance process and incorporating the governance process as guided by the guiding principles starts with the commitment. And I just wanted to leave a thought with the people who are participating today around the process in terms of implementing human rights is as important, if not more important, than the end point. So the process of developing or reviewing a human rights policy and commitment statement is more important in terms of allowing people to make the connection between their day-to-day jobs and human rights, than the end statement. And I would say that's sort of my general experience in a whole range of companies. Is there's always a tension of, please, Richard, come on, just write the statement. You've already done it for this many other companies. Can you just give us the statement? Or can you just give us the due diligence procedures and process? And in our experience, you know, the most significant challenge we need to overcome, particularly in terms of resolving governance questions, is allowing the organisation, the company, to make the connection between the relevance of human rights and the successful operation of that business. And risk management is often a good entree, but not necessarily the only entree. But the process and a focus on the process of developing a human rights governance and management approach is as important in my experience than the end point of where you arrive at. So the next slide, if I may, James. And just wanted to offer a number of quotes and a number of insights that came from the many conversations that we had when we pulled the insights paper together. And I think Andre's about to, and I already apologise to Andre for quoting him already before he actually speaks. I think that's absolutely right, is that you do see the agenda led by different people. What I've been fascinated by is that broadening in terms of the key actor who raises the issue, from the sustainability team or the sustainability champion, to now seeing that broaden out much more. And certainly with the growing presence of regulatory drivers, we're certainly seeing legal counsel and company secretaries being much more active in terms of asking questions around, well, what are not just our legal obligations, and within the Modern Slavery Act, you need to then report what you are doing, or if you aren't doing anything. But then what that's doing is triggering legal counsel and those parts of the business to show a much deeper interest in terms of what's the day-to-day management approach that we actually have in terms of identifying and then managing the human rights risks within our supply chain. And that's then going up to the board level as well. So that's a key driver in my experience that's broadened and deepened governance engagement, existing corporate governance engagement into the process. One of the biggest challenges that I've seen in terms of current activity that the guiding principles is driving would be the identification of human rights risks and impacts, and the integration of that into existing enterprise risk management processes. So from a governance perspective, and certainly management approach perspective, I think that's a question that still needs to be worked through, and that was a key insight that came from the interviews that we did when we specifically asked around governance, was that this was a work in progress. That, you know, companies that have been quite long on the journey in terms of engaging with human rights were quite honest about saying, we haven't got all the answers yet. We don't have the full value yet, certainly from putting that human rights lens in terms of understanding our company's activities and the impacts that it has on people. We haven't yet got the full value in terms of what we are currently identifying, in terms of feeding that into our enterprise risk management and then seeing that reflected and considered at the highest governance level as well. So final few reflections that I wanted to offer. Next slide, James. It should bring us to just the three key points I wanted to leave you with this morning. Senior executive involvement was a very common theme across all of the companies that we talked to. It's critical to see that tone from the top around why it's important for companies to engage in understanding their human rights impacts and the risk to both the company and the people because of the company's activities. And certainly that's critical in terms of getting the answers to questions like, how do I get the full value from my human rights risk identification processes in terms of the broader understanding of the business's human rights risks? And certainly, how does the business's enterprise risk management approach consider risk to people? Because that's a very different perspective, is the business first having to put that lens on, whereas a traditional enterprise risk management is very much company-centric. UN guiding principles are asking for an additional perspective, and that is putting people, having a people-centric perspective in there. And certainly, with the work that we've done with mining companies, I'd say that's where the more maturing work is happening around truly integrating that people-centric view of human rights risk into enterprise risk management processes. Because the business's activities across all its functions has a potential impact on human rights, there's significant value in taking a cross-functional approach. That this isn't one function's responsibility, but this is many functions, and we've seen, those organisations that have made the fastest and certainly the most, the stickiest progress in terms of embedding respect for human rights have taken that cross-functional working group. Now that also feeds into the educational component. And that's where I started with that challenge around so much of this work that we do around business and human rights needs that educational component, needs to allow people to make those connections to why the human rights lens is valuable and important to consider for business. And then I'd leave you with that last thought around, it's access to dedicated expertise that's really important to facilitate people within the organisations and within those, particularly those governance roles, allowing them to make the connection between respect for human rights and the governing of their organisations. Now, that expertise may be internal, and there's certainly many models for that where it's internal and then it becomes an internal support, but certainly the choice of the right expertise is critical. Now, final slide from me. There's more. I've hopefully just given you a flavour of some of those key insights from that particular engagement that we did. And I just wanted to leave you there, James, that next slide, leave you there with that link for those that had an interest in exploring more. And very happy to answer some questions, James. Back to you.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Richard. That was great. I think we might leave questions to the end, if that's all right, so we can have a chance to get through the presentations and have a longer discussion collectively at the end. So please do write your questions in if you have them at this stage while they're fresh in your mind, and I'll circle back to them at the end of the session. Now that we'd like to move along and present some member company perspective on the issue of governance, so hearing directly from AkzoNobel in terms of how they've worked to embed human rights into their governance procedures, talk about some of the challenges they faced and the way that they've tackled this complex issue. So if I could hand over to Andre Veneman, Corporate Director of Sustainability at AkzoNobel. The floor is yours, Andre.
Good morning all, and James, thanks for the opportunity to share our pathway on the human rights framework, and Richard, thanks for already referring to AkzoNobel. I will highlight 5 topics, and I will start sharing what has been the strong driver to bring human rights to the forefront in AkzoNobel. And then how do we assess the human rights risks? I will say something about the governance structure we have in place. Also some remarks on the goals and processes that we have in place to measure and report performance. And there will be a few remarks on the key challenges we probably all face in this area of human rights. Going to the next sheet. A few words about AkzoNobel. We are a coatings specialty chemicals company. When people think, did you use our products today? Some people might say, maybe not. But then when I would ask people, did you use toothpaste today or shampoo? Or did you use salt? this morning, or did you use your mobile phone? Then most people are able to build that link. How a company like us produces essential ingredients, essential protection, essential color. Ever since 2003, we have started sustainability as part of our business strategy. And today, I think sometimes they are big words, but also at EXCO level, people would say, well, sustainability, it is about our purpose, it is our brand equity, it is our core principle, it is our employee value proposition. And in fact, I'm not allowed whether I'm allowed to say, but nowadays many of our people would say it's even our defense mechanism against unsolicited takeover. Let's move to the next sheet. I think it's all of us who have been in sustainability for a longer period of time, we know that the context of sustainability is continuously changing. I think in 2002 we signed the United Nations Global Compact, but in 2011 the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, we thought of that as a very important framework. We had been working in teams of Professor Ruggie and Shift in preparing these UN guidelines, guiding principles, but also in 2015, the issuing of the Sustainable Development Goals and COP21, it serves this process very well because it is a new lens to view impacts. And we have appreciated the Sustainable Development Goals as a great compass to drive sustainable business development. And we used already for about 8 years something that we call the Planet Possible strategy, which is our framework stating how 9 billion people will be able to live within the boundaries of one planet. And this Planet Possible strategy is very, very well aligned with the Sustainable Development Goals. But then there is also need to demonstrate and to create shared economic, environmental, and social value in all business we do. Let's move to the next sheet. So I hope the connection will become more clear quite soon. I start from a high level. The purpose of the company, the SDGs, before I move to the human rights topic. What we have done is we have embraced that shared value thinking, and in our company for quite a couple of years now, we have been working on measuring the three-dimensional profit and loss. Last year, we did that for the company as a whole, for all of our businesses. So in close cooperation with groups like True Price and GIST, Pavan Subdev, we have built that model to describe economic, environmental, and social profit and loss. And for sure, work done by World Business Council like the Natural Capital Protocol and the Social Capital Protocol have been very useful inputs. Let's move on to the next sheet. We will not focus today. We like to think in these 6 quadrants. How can you generate with every euro you spend? That's the focus point. When we spend money, when we invest, when we do appropriation requests, when we spend capex, our people should be able to think simultaneously about economic, environmental, and social value creation and social risk reduction. They are not interchangeable. You cannot exchange economic profit and loss with environmental, and you can also not exchange negative social impact with positive social impact. So these 6 quadrants are quite important to differentiate. And for instance, on social impact, when we think about risk reduction, we definitely think about risk reduction for our own people and contracted employees, 0 injuries, but also the risk from our products, chemicals industry. How do we move to 0 harm and a non-toxic environment? Our supply chain, how do we drive and work with suppliers to move towards 0 human rights violations? And how do we work with our neighbors and ensure and provide them with safety, also when they are close to our plants. On the positive side, we think about the positive impact to our own people, capability building, engagement, diversity, but also the positive impact of our products, the products that prevent iron deficiency, or the products that provide fire protection, and our programs like the programs to create jobs, vocational training, social cohesion, to improve the quality of life in cities. So this is a way of thinking about reducing the negative impact, in fact moving to zero negative impact, and to understand the positive impact and enhance the positive impact from our operations. And human rights is for us the right corner below. Human rights is part of the bigger social impact shared value creation framework. It is driving to zero negative impact, zero risk, because risk there is non-negotiable. It should be zero tolerance. So in summary, why did we take action on human rights? And that's why I expressed it. Some companies would say, well, it's based on regulatory pressure, it's based on regulatory risks, it's based on reputation damage, NGOs. We also signed the UK Modern Slavery Act. But I think when people say sustainability is our purpose, we want to be seen as a sustainability leader, we want to generate positive economic, environmental, social impact, then you have a very positive hook to link your human rights programs to. Let's move to the next sheet. So how do we assess human rights? We believe that the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights provide a very decent framework: protect, respect, remedy. And as Richard already said, yes, in your sessions, in your enterprise risk management sessions, it requires a different attitude. It's not about the risk to business, it is about the risk to people. And we focused indeed on our own operators and contracted employees, on our suppliers, our customers and end users, but also on society in which we operate and our neighbors. And we did perform, maybe the next sheet, we did perform and use the enterprise risk management methodology, but Richard is completely right. It requires a bit of different thinking. We already always face that with sustainability, where we say don't describe the negative risks, really focus on the positive opportunities as well. Here with enterprise risk management, we did these sessions with business teams, with the Human Rights Steering Committee. We also had an enterprise risk management session with EXCO, and it's on one hand it's a great way to educate and to do awareness raising, but it does require a slightly different approach, indeed putting people first. We also involved extensive external stakeholder reviews. We worked we looked at many companies, we talked to external stakeholders in the NGO world, and we made use of a very decent external advisor to help us with the structured process. So yeah, this was our way to start with a big bunch of overall human rights risks, and to end up with the four most salient issues, which we'll use in AkzoNobel to assess, due diligence, to measure, and to report on. Let's move to the next sheet. What we found very useful is if people start to think, oh, it's a whole new program, it's a whole new process, but I think it's very helpful when some of the improvements in risk assessment, identifying the most salient issues, in assessment, you can make use of existing processes. And in our company, we found entry points for existing processes where we could easily embed human rights management. For instance, already for many, many years, we have a strong HSE audit program to assess safety, people process safety, but it was quite easy to include workplace standards, overtime issues, community involvement in that process. And on the supply chain, already for many years, we have a program called supplier support visits, but also a business partner framework. And with 20 chemical companies we work on together for sustainability for suppliers, it was not difficult to build the human rights assessment processes into the supplier support visits and into the business partner framework. And also, when we talk about business conduct, we do have our code of conduct, our business principles, our speak up system. And after creating awareness on and education on human rights topics, we could easily use the speak up systems and the business principles as the grievance mechanisms for human rights issues as well. And the final example, already for many years we work on product safety, going far beyond legislation. We call it, we focus on societal concern, customer concern, driving towards a zero harm approach. And our product safety programs, our customer focused product stewardship programs were an excellent way to include human rights risks, how people cannot be exposed to hazards of our products. So in general, it is very helpful when people see it's not about establishing new processes, it is about understanding the processes you need for your salient issues and to decently embed the human rights framework and to make it embedded in existing structures. Okay, move to the next sheet, which this will come later. But let me say a few words on the governance structure that we have in place. In our annual report, it's extensively described the governance structure we have in place. And indeed, it starts with board and executive level oversight. So, some years ago, it started very much with the sustainability department creating advocacy, acting as a change agent. But today it's very clear our board, supervisory board and EXCO, they review the human rights framework, and two people at EXCO level, the director of legal and the director of human resource, they have a direct responsibility to oversee the embedding of the human rights framework. Then it was quite helpful to build a multidisciplinary human rights committee. People from compliance, human resources, procurement, people from the 3 business areas, occupational health. It is a broad committee of people covering all aspects of the human rights issues that we have identified, and their task is to improve the company human rights policies and framework, to identify, to mitigate and to report on the human rights risks in our own operations, but very important across the entire value chain. Their task is also to execute and monitor the improvement programs on the most salient issues, to track performance and report on progress, and to work with the stakeholders and strengthen the stakeholder dialogue. Today they are in India in the stakeholder dialogue, and to educate and create awareness on using the grievance mechanisms for human rights topics as well. I promised to also say something about the goals and processes in place to measure and report performance. There, I think we have some frameworks. In our company, we like to use the Dow Jones Sustainability Index as really as a continuous benchmark and an improvement tool. and we are quite happy with the way Dow Jones Sustainability Index is improving year on year the reporting on the human rights framework, but also Global Reporting Initiative, the Sustainable Development Goal Compass. They provide decent guidance. It is right that there is a need to move from qualitative to quantitative reporting, but by a deeper understanding of the most salient issues, I was already able to share some elements of you. The zero harm agenda of our products, the zero waste agenda, the supplier support objectives and KPIs, the grievance mechanisms and the way we use grievance mechanisms to better understand, but even topics like legal cases. Sometimes it's an art in your company to create openness and transparency, but there we have areas, health and safety, working conditions at our sites, discrimination and harassment among employees, underage labor in the supply chain. We have identified these areas. We have clear processes and assessment process in place, the due diligence programs, and the grievance mechanism. So this offers us clearly with a model to not only report in a qualitative way, but also to report as of now in a much more quantitative way on progress, on clear objectives, and with the challenge to make it very transparent and to be open. The final remarks would then be on some of the key challenges. Positively in our company, we said let's link it to the leadership, sustainability leadership agenda, and not to an agenda of fear for stakeholders, fear for risk and reputation. We also said we clearly need to focus on our own operations first. This is not America first, this is own operations first. If you expect all of your employees to be ambassadors for better work with our suppliers and a different focus on our customers, then it's clear that in our own company, topics of workplace conditions, an absolute safety culture, a culture of integrity is key. Awareness and education in our own operations. We have benefited. Sometimes we say, it's so difficult and that's a challenge to work on the second tier suppliers, but I think it's also a positive one. We have learned to appreciate to work with external partners. Some issues were found in our supply chain when people said, how do you source your mica? And fortunately, our procurement people did not take a defensive response. They were very open, worked with Terre des Hommes and with Somo, and said, let's directly work with our Chinese suppliers of this product and let us make sure that together with the NGOs, we go to the producers in India. We do not want to walk away, but we need to work with different partners, also with NGOs, to turn a complex issue like this long value chain into a good practice, into a best practice. And in working with other partners in the industry and working with the NGOs, you can turn a complexity and a challenge into an opportunity. Definitely we see a challenge in further developing the human rights reporting and the social impact reporting, but I noticed that many companies like ours, we are all struggling with the same thing. We all would like to move on with more quantitative human rights reporting and more social impact reporting. We are very eager to work in an open source methodology, share our knowledge, our progress with WBCSD, and drive progress. Of course, it is about working across the full value chain. Of course, it is about the tone at the top. I think what could be a challenge and a positive opportunity for many of us is not to focus only on the negative side. Don't hide it. It should be very clear. Human rights is about negative social impact. There should be zero tolerance. But when this is seen as an element of sustainability leadership, it becomes also part of a positive agenda. No negative impact, but a strong drive to generate positive social impact to our own people by the products that we deliver to society and by the programs. And go to the next sheet. This is one area where we move to the positive. Based on our work on social impact, we were able to work with 150 partners, 20 key stakeholders, finance sector, other companies, universities, on a very positive approach. How can we improve the lives of people in slum areas? 1 billion people living in slum areas today. With all the investments that we are going to make in resilient cities, smart cities, big infrastructure programs, 4 trillion euros per year, why would we not be able to work on, first of all, reducing the negative impact, making sure we have a zero tolerance for human rights topics, but link it to the positive agenda of how can we unite our forces, drive the Sustainable Development Goals agenda, and drive positive social impact through the way we do business, as a way of business transformation, as a way of simultaneously delivering economic, social, and environmental impact. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share our progress and our challenges.
Thank you so much, Andre. That was fantastic. A really thorough overview both of the business case for doing this and some interesting food for thought in terms of how to get buy-in across the organization in terms of messaging and in terms of process. So now there's a chance for us to address some of the questions that have come in. I mean, just plow through some of the questions that we've had here already through the chat window. Bear with me 1 second, because some of these are quite lengthy. Here we go. So we have a question from Gerald saying, AXO's existing entry points, can you give more information on how you embedded it into TFS? And then another question for Andre, human rights issues require specific skills to identify challenges. How do you address the capacity gap that may exist when you incorporate human rights aspects into existing processes? So, for example, supplier support visits, and existing teams may have limited knowledge of human rights. So, I guess to summarize that, how do you ensure that your internal teams, when you're embedding into existing functions, how do you ensure that the expertise makes its way into those functions? So, a question for you there, Andre.
Yeah. Good. Well, the topic, for instance, of supportive supplier visits was quite an interesting one. Of course, our procurement people have probably similar kind of training as yours. How do we source products of good quality at a low price? And it was quite a challenge when we started to talk in 2005, 2006 about responsible sourcing and our responsibility across the value chain. What we did is to build the capability is, first of all, have built very clear protocols. And first, make the business case understand. People had noticed that with some of our competitors, suppliers in China had to close their plants because of sustainability, environmental pollution issues. So we said this should not happen to us. How do we build a comprehensive framework? And we built this framework with topics like how do we review the safety and working conditions, labor conditions at payment, salary, working schedules, working hours at our supplier sites. And this was not easy for our procurement people because their training is different. So initially, we took the role of a catalyst, and we identified 300 of these key suppliers, and together with the procurement function, we visited them, and we would go into the dormitories and offer them to train them on safety programs and to review salary schemes, and we called it supportive supplier visits, because we did not want to make it part of a kind of audit and policing actions. There was bilateral benefit. They understood that we would be interested to buy their raw materials, partner with them, products of good quality, good price, and produced in decent working conditions. And if they would meet those challenges and work with us to improve, then they would have access to selling their raw materials to us, not only in the country where they operated, but globally. So I think working with other partners, like even with Amnesty and with Shift, building a protocol, working also with other companies, how they had built their protocols for sustainable supplier visits, and then bringing our health and safety people and our sustainability people alongside with our procurement people. That was an important starting point. Of course, later on we moved to education sessions, training sessions. By now, when our procurement people have sustainable days with their suppliers, they definitely include topics like human rights, working conditions, child labor, but also carbon pricing. It has become an integral part. But indeed, you are right. It is an art to take each of your functions, human resources, marketing and sales, procurement, to embed sustainability, to embed social impact and human rights into their training programs, and to help them, take them by the hand, to integrate it into their capability building, into their curricula.
Can I just offer one reflection, James? And that was we worked with 120 buyers from a major retailer, and what the trick there was to give them permission to raise questions when they weren't comfortable. So there's also something about not making it too technical initially. You know, human rights is fundamentally about respecting other human beings. And when we had discussions with this buyer group, they were the ones who were able to very rapidly share a whole range of, sort of lead indicators. It was as simple as I walk into a factory and I see the housekeeping is a mess. You know, the place is not well kept. Immediately I'm on guard, because I think if they can't keep their environment clean, how are they treating the workers? And I guess there's an element there of just giving permission to raise questions and escalate questions that previously I would just feel uncomfortable, but I would take no action. So I just wanted to add that to what Andre, absolutely support what Andre is saying, is that capability building is critical, those processes are critical, but there's something there around the culture. There's a shift in the culture as well around giving permission to raise things that make us uncomfortable, particularly in a supply chain context, but more broadly as well.
Great. And then perhaps a question leading on from that touches something that we've had is how, in terms of when you're going out to the different parts of the business to assess risks and impacts, and then doing deep dives into particular impacts, is there any way to combat? Do you feel that, because I think sometimes those parts of the business which you're addressing, or the areas that you're trying to get on board, will be automatically defensive, and take the approach that, why are you picking on us, or why start with us first, or it's and there's the implication there that they've been doing something wrong for a long period of time, and that can lead to that defensive reaction. Any suggestions in the best way to approach sort of addressing impacts or embedding into particular functions without getting that defensive reaction?
What was helpful in our case is that based on this assessment and overview of all risks, we and the risk assessment, we really made sure we got it was accepted at the top. We first had the tone at the top. The board said we want a full training. The ExCo and supervisory board were trained on human rights. Then we took them through this assessment, and we said now we are going to do a deep dive on a couple of topics. We will really go and to our own sites in some areas and focus on topics like overtime and working conditions. And we will certainly also report on some products and safety issues with some products. And this is the clear program we are going to follow. um, 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 uh, we want your approval to go ahead. So there was a very clear starting point from the top. One that I do not like so much, I'm not proud of it, but we could also say, it's also, guys, we are, Dow Jones is for us a very important element. Human rights is a very important part of the Dow Jones. If you are serious about ongoing leadership and using the Dow Jones as a benchmark, we should all get involved because it's a topic of leadership. We should get it right. We also used numbers and data. Like you might think it's all fine, but here we have some overtime records. And if we are serious about due diligence, remediation, we should accept that we go and find solutions in those areas where even our own employees said, oh, but we like overtime. No, human rights, we might have a different view. We will seek external advice. We connect with people because we want to seek solutions. But I think it is a process of connecting, identifying and providing proof for salient issues, having a process where people understand how you go about the process, getting assurance from the top. If you do it alone from your sustainability department or compliance department, people will see it as a regulatory burden. If people see it's part of leadership and our purpose and our core principle, it will help. And indeed, you need to connect it with bottom up. But for instance, in working conditions, it can be done with pride. You can say, instead of controlling the sites, you can say, we start offering all of our employees across the globe, wherever they are, a very decent working conditions to be proud of. Top down, bottom up, clear focus on salient issues, and a clear program where people understand that it's not too broad and endless, but a focus with a step-by-step improvement program behind.
Great, thank you, Andre. And then perhaps, Richard, one last question for you. One of your three key things to have is CEO buy-in or top-level leadership behind this. From some of the conversations you had as part of the compilation of the report, could you point to any key elements or any advice that you think are important to persuading CEOs to the importance of this agenda, or getting CEOs bought into this agenda, for any members who perhaps haven't had that top-level commitment or awareness of this issue as yet?
Well, it's probably like Andre. I'm a little bit reluctant to admit it, but I got to be honest, they're children. Yeah, and perhaps I use that as a metaphor for, no CEO wants to be responsible for human rights negative impacts, and then particularly CEOs today who are in their last or their second last role. It's legacy. So there's something there around personal responsibility and wanting to be seen to be running a respectful and leading a respectful business, but there's also a legacy aspect, and both of those I have both myself and also seen others use that within business very successfully in terms of getting that commitment, getting that buy-in. I mean, it is fundamentally a very personal question to ask, as well as how do you want to treat other human beings? And I guess we're doing, that is what the UN guiding principles have given us as a structure where we can answer that question from a corporation to corporation, corporation to community, corporation to people working in the supply chain. We're bringing that human question into the heart of the corporate context. So it's interesting because the defensiveness I often hear is around relevance. I'd also say it's not that it's not something we should do. It's something that's just not relevant to my business. I work in a developed country. We have regulations, government, rule of law. It's not relevant to my business in the context that we work in. That's fine if I'm a mining company working in Africa, but it's not relevant. And I think that's where broadening the understanding of how all of the decisions a company makes can potentially impact on people is critical, and that's what's critical there is moving beyond the thinking of human rights as something about Amnesty International, people being locked up, people losing their civil or political rights, to understanding those broader set of internationally recognised human rights, where I think corporations can potentially have greater impact on those social, cultural and economic rights.
Fantastic, thank you. Well, we've reached the top of the hour, and if I'm to continue living in Switzerland, I have to be punctual. So I think we're going to have to wrap things up there for today, but just very quickly to say a big thank you to Andre and to Richard for their time this morning. Any follow-up questions, please feel free to send through to me, and I'll be happy to pass them along to Andre and Richard, who I'm sure in turn will be very happy to answer them. We're hoping to have another webinar in the coming weeks looking at the issue of human rights impact assessments, so I'll keep you posted in terms of how that's shaping up. But for now, thank you very much for joining us for today, and wish you all a good day and a good rest of the week. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Andre.